Hello, here we are with another edition of the live Ask a Private Investigator program. I have a couple questions queued up from prior programs and from existing clients. I'm going to talk about how to get recovery from losses due to a scam. The other subject we're going to talk about is how to get private records from vehicle assets and maybe searching some other assets. So we're going to jump right in. The first question, most of our clients that are new inquiries have to do with some type of online scam or online fraud where a person has sent money to an investment scam or some type of fraud. And the big question is, how do you get your money back? Well, we do a lot of asset searches for those types of clients, but in many cases, the recovery comes from other third parties. It may be possible to get recovery from the fraud operator, but here's a couple examples where this is an old scam. We'll take a look at an article where the Department of Justice just this week, this is December 10th, 2020, paid out almost $500 million to victims of the Madoff Ponzi scheme, which happened more than 10 years ago, right? And the DOJ has been working on this for many, many years. They added another $488 million to the victims, bringing the total recovery to 80%, very high percentage from a Ponzi scheme, a fraud scheme. The money will go to 37,000 victims. Sixth payment from the feds. Total recovery $3.2 billion. So this happened back. He was sentenced in 2009, so this happened back many, many years ago. So, as a victim of a Ponzi scheme, you always want to get your case put in early. You want to do as much investigation as you can early to find out who the scammers are. But there's many opportunities for those types of recovery. Another opportunity is from what we call third party. Even if the government is not involved with a scam prosecution, there may be third parties. We just had a case a couple weeks ago where there was a bank which opened an account for a scammer without getting proper ID. And because of that, the victims were able to get recovery from a bank. On a much, much larger scale, the Wall Street Journal reported today that Credit Suisse, which is a large European bank, was charged from activity that they undertook in 2004 to 2008 because they didn't comply with provisions against money laundering. It's very unlikely that they actually participated in money laundering, but they probably didn't follow their own rules, their own guidelines, fill out proper forms. But what that did was it allowed a criminal organization to launder money, right? And when that happens, they usually have to pay big fines or have other consequences. In the bank here, it said, the Credit Suisse was astonished to be charged. It said they called it supposed organizational deficiencies. And that's typically what it is in a bank. It's not that they're intentionally trying to participate in a fraud. It's just that they get lazy and they maybe leave out certain documents. It's very, very common. Credit Suisse is one of the largest European banks. They're out of Zurich, Switzerland. And if they don't follow their own guidelines, many other smaller banks may be doing the same thing inadvertently. It's not like anybody at the bank is trying to do a scam, but because of those what's called deficiencies, sometimes scammers can take their fraud farther, and because of that may become liable. So if you have a scam that you become a victim of, you want to make sure that you have all third-party participation documented, whether it's an accountant, whether it's a um, even a bank attorney, somebody who is part of that process. You want to make sure um, you have that documented. So if in the future you need to recover from this scam, that's something that that happens. That's one of the most common questions. How do I get money back from a scam? We had one this morning where somebody sent 12,000 and some change to a Bitcoin scam, and they're looking to get that money back. So that's very common. Let's see what other questions that we have before we move on to our vehicle search. Again, don't forget to email the questions. help@activeintel.com is our email address. Any question you want to ask an investigator. Here's one that we'll skip that one. Something. So are you asking, and this person will know who I'm talking about, if investigator can do something illegal or if it can do something more than a private person can? And this is for a visitor with the initial M. Well, first I'll start while I'm waiting for your answer. An investigator can't do anything illegal. A lot of times clients will come to an investigator wanting the investigator to do something that is against the law. That's not what investigators do. However, there may be cases where an investigator can do something where a private individual may have less ability to. A good example is surveillance. Let's say you have a legitimate civil case against another person. Could be a divorce case, could be a lawsuit, and you want to monitor the activities of that person for legitimate purposes for that court case, to see if they travel to a certain place, to see if maybe they go to a bank, to see if they dispose of evidence, to see if they drive drunk, whatever the case might be. In theory, the counterparty to the case, meaning you, the plaintiff, could observe that person. You could follow them. You could watch them. However, there's a fine line between surveillance and stalking. If you're a party to a case and you're following around the other person in the case, your attorney might tell you that's not a good idea, because it's a borderline between if you're stalking that person, intimidating that person, are you trying to go out of your way to have them see you, to scare them? That can be a gray area where a licensed private investigator will do that surveillance or monitoring in a way that is, that's going to be legal, right? They're going to follow the right laws. They're not going to break traffic laws. They're not going to intimidate the person. They're not going to use recording of audio that's illegal. Presumably, if they're licensed and they know what they're doing, they would follow the proper laws. And in addition, they're also not going to use magnification devices that might be not allowable under the law. For example, a person has an expectation of privacy in their own home. If they have their drapes open and you can see in the house with the naked eye as you're driving by, that's probably going to be legit. And again, none of what we do on these videos is designed to be legal advice. You want to make sure you get good advice from an attorney before you take any action. But this is just general information that comes from investigations. So yeah, if you're driving by and somebody has their window open and you casually see what's going on in the window as you drive by, that's one thing. If you are, parked at the end of the road and you have a, 200 power telescope and you're peeking in their window, even if it's open, in most cases, that's going to be not legal because the person has an expectation of privacy in their own home, even if they have their window open, their drapes open. So, so you're right. So I see the person's asking not to do something illegal, but can an investigator do something that a private person can't do? There may be some instances where the private person would either be prohibited from or at least discouraged from trying to do their own surveillance or their own witness interviews, where an investigator might put some distance in between to make it more legitimate. But they're not going to do anything illegal. And you don't want an investigator to do anything illegal, because if your investigator does something illegal, the results may not be able to be used. If you go to court and you say, here is evidence that I received. Well, if the investigator you hired obtained that evidence illegally, you might not be able to use it. And that defeats the whole purpose of having that case done by an investigator. So make sure that your investigator is doing something legal. In the case of document research or evidence, one of the key terms is what's called the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, GLB. And let me see if I can get some info on that pulled up so we can take a look at that. It was a law passed in the 90s by three legislators in response to some hacking that was done. It's basically a right to privacy. And here, we'll pull it up on the screen here. Here's the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. It requires financial institutions to explain information sharing practices. Okay, that's the basis of it. But it also covers people from obtaining information illegally, right? So if you are a private person and you want to get somebody's private information, let's say banking information or private vehicle information, you can't pretend to be that person. You can't call up the bank and say, hey, I'm Joe Schmo and I want to get my bank balance, right? Because you're not really Joe Schmo and that would be illegal. On the other hand, if you, let's say, want to get information about somebody's car loan, unless you have the proper legal channels, if you try to get it illegally by pretending to be that person and calling up the bank, that might not be legal. So those are examples of how an investigator would do things properly, GLB compliant. That's one of the things you want to look for when you're speaking to an investigator or when you're looking to hire an investigator to get information. Make sure that their processes are GLB compliant, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act compliant, because if they're not, first of all, you can't use them in your court process or wherever you want to use the results. And number two, could get you into trouble if they were obtained illegally, whether you did it or an investigator did it. And here's a good example. We'll talk about the vehicle information. That'll lead us into our next subject, where we have some clients in one of our divisions that in many cases want to get information about a vehicle. Let's say you have a license plate number or a VIN number of a vehicle and you want to find out who the owner is or who the lien holder is or some other information. That information is not public, right? You can't just run a title search or a VIN search on a vehicle and get the name of the owner. And the reason for it, and it's a good reason, is you want to maintain privacy of your vehicle. Let's say if you're driving down the street and somebody doesn't like the way you drive and they write down your plate and then they show up knocking on your door. You don't want that. So there's laws passed. In this case, it's called the DPPA, the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, that says that a DMV cannot release information about a vehicle except for meeting certain conditions. One of them is you have to identify yourself of who you are getting this information. You have to have ID. You can't just anonymously call up or look online to say, I want the owner of license plate number 12345 ABC, right? You have to sign a form. And here's an example of what that form looks like. Let's take a look. This is one particular state, and even though it's a federal law, the DPPA, it's done at the state level because driver's records and vehicle records are kept by a local state DMV. Okay, so this happens to be South Dakota. It's just a random one, but you'll see most states are about the same. And it says, according with the provisions of the Federal Driver's Privacy Protection Act, DPPA. And even though this is South Dakota, they have to follow the federal law. Okay, a written form must be submitted before certain information can be released. And this will be the same for almost all states with a little bit different format. And it'll ask you, you're looking for record search, title history, that kind of thing. First thing it's going to ask you, requester information. Who are you, right? Name of person requesting information. And you have to identify yourself, driver's license, social security number. They're not playing. You have to tell them who you are, right? If you're doing on behalf of a company, you have to put in who you're representing, street address. And we do this all the time. So if one of our investigators sends one of these in, they put their name, their ID, and then representing our company name, Active Intel or whatever company is requesting it. And then you have to put in, what are you requesting? Are you requesting the driver's information on a person, or are you requesting vehicle information on a motor vehicle. And if the motor vehicle, you have to put in the VIN number, license plate number, year, make, and address. Usually you don't need both VIN number and license plate. One of the two is sufficient. So yeah, that's great. You put that in, but there's more. You have to actually certify the reason for this. And even though this is a South Dakota form, all these reasons, you'll see here, there's check boxes. There's usually 7, right? Because this language, no matter what state form you're filling out, New York State has a form like this, California has a form like this, Texas has a form like this. The language will almost be word for word on this section from one state to another. And the reason is because this comes from the federal law. You have to give a reason why you are requesting the information. Are you the record owner, meaning that you're asking for your own records? Are you a government agency? So if a police officer, or it says right here, law enforcement or a court is requesting it, you check this box. Now, for the use in normal course of business by a legitimate business, to verify accuracy or if such information is no longer correct, right? So that's one of the other reasons. For use in conjunction with a civil, criminal, or court proceeding. So if you have a civil case, this is something you could use. If you're an insurance company, right, you want to check on somebody who crashed into your insured person. Providing notice of owners, towed, impounded, or abandoned vehicle. For use by any licensed private investigative agency. Okay, so, and if you're a private investigative agency, you have to put your license information. For use by an employer to verify information for a commercial driver's license. So you have to check one of these boxes while you're requesting this information. And you have to have it notarized, right? Here's a notary section. At least in South Dakota, you do. Some states don't require. And then there's other forms. If you are the vehicle owner, sometimes if you get permission from the vehicle owner, they can sign here. But this 7-box disclosure, you will see the same wording on almost every state because it's private information. So getting back to the question, what can an investigator do that you can't? Well, in that case, there's a specific checkbox to get private vehicle information if you're a private investigator. If you're not a private investigator, you may have to meet one of those other criteria. Maybe you do. Maybe if you have a civil case, you can check that box. Maybe if you're a company using it in the normal course of business, you can check off that box. But it may be that as a consumer, private consumer, if you have no court case against a person, you have no business interest in the person, you may not be able to request private vehicle information from the DMV about a vehicle owner. So to answer your question, can a private investigator do something that a person can't? That's an example of where that may or may not be the case. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's see what else we have for requests. So how can a private investigator prove a person is working and has income? So it sounds like in this case, it's from the rest of the message, it's a divorce or child support case, and maybe the person is saying they don't have an income to pay, and this happens a lot. And if you think that somebody who owes spousal maintenance or support or child support is not paying and they're claiming that they don't have an income, there's several ways to verify that. And as an investigator, the way that we would go about doing it is first running an employment check to see if they're currently employed. They have payroll deductions, tax deductions. The second thing we would do is do a bank account search so you can get records of deposits going into a bank account, because sometimes a person may be off the books as an employee if they're a contractor, if they're paid under the table, if they're some kind of freelancer, gig worker. They may not have normal employee deductions. To detect an employee, sometimes they have to have, FICA and payroll taxes being deducted for that to trigger an employment search hit. And if they're, getting paid by the job to set up, cameras for video, or they're getting paid as a contractor to do, let's say, carpentry, maybe they don't have those normal deductions being made. Somebody's just giving them a check at the end of the week or handing them cash. or doing some more common now is electronic payments like Zelle or PayPal or Venmo or one of the other non-standard payment methods. And those can be detected, and also the source. So if we see, let's say, a Venmo payment is happening, every Friday for, between $300 and $500 from, Joe's construction company, well, then it stands to reason that maybe they are a contractor for that construction company. And maybe that would be a source to go for garnishment. So yeah, an investigator can find employment through a number of means. There's other ways. Sometimes it comes from location determination, whether it's direct observation. Sometimes there's electronic methods of detecting a location through mobile devices or through check-ins or through IP addresses where a person communicates from. If we see that a person every day, around 9 o'clock shows up at a certain location and leaves there at about 4:40 or 4:50 every day, well, that's a good indication that that may be their source of employment. So there's a number of ways to determine employment. And then once you do that, then you can refute the statement that the person is making, that there is no income to pay whatever it is. It might be spousal maintenance, it could be rent, it could be some other payment that a person's claiming they can't make because they do not have income. And employment verification is a difficult thing because it's not like a credit report where you can pull a credit check and find out somebody's credit cards or where they have loans. Employment doesn't show up on those kind of searches, so you have to be very diligent in how you look for those. So let's take a look on the list. We'll save that for another time. One of the questions is, what's the most interesting type of case we've worked on? That one we'll save for another episode. So here's one regarding finding the location of a missing person. I'm not sure if it's okay, this is a lost relative. Okay, so yeah, this comes up a lot where if somebody has a relative, it could be a parent that moved away a long time ago, could be a sibling, could be an adoption, and the idea is to find where this person is now located. Typically, by the time the case gets to us, the easy stuff has been done, right? The client has looked at social media. They've looked online for different search databases. They may have looked for email addresses or phone numbers or back searches. That's usually already been done, because if it was that easy, you wouldn't need us, right? So if you've already done all that, that's great. If you haven't done that yet and you're trying to find a missing person, start with social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, even older sites where somebody may have a dormant profile. A lot of times you can find things on non-directly social media sites, but like photo sharing sites, old sites like Photo Bucket, or even MySpace, those kind of sites where somebody may have had a profile a long time ago that they haven't kept active, sometimes is a good source. If you've exhausted all those efforts, what else can be done? What would an investigator do once you get past all the easy stuff? Well, one of the things is to look at what we just talked about, which is employment. Does the person currently have employment? Is their tax ID number associated with a payroll record? Is their name associated with any professional license or designation? Sometimes the other thing we'll look at is name changes. Part of the reason many times a person can't be located is they've changed their name. Well, the name change is a legal event. It's an official event that creates a record. Creates a record that this event happened, and you have to find that document that was filed, usually with a court at the county level, to show what their new name is, and then you can start that search process with the new name. In most cases, it'll still be related to the same tax ID number. Most jurisdictions do not allow for to get a new social security number just because you're changing your name. There may be ways you can change your social security number, but usually it's not just because you're changing your name. The other thing we can look at is driver's license checks. Remember that last form we looked at, that DPPA form? We can look for driver's licenses. Most people have a license. The hardest people to find, but it's not impossible, is somebody who is completely um, detached from society. They have no job, they have no driver's license, they don't have any official contact with government, meaning that they don't pay taxes. Usually that means the person is kind of homeless. But in many cases, there are even more documentation of that person if they're homeless. We found one of our early cases back from the late 2000s was a case where we located a missing person, it was a relative that was homeless. And the way they were found is because homeless people have interactions with government on a regular basis. They may avail themselves of social services. They may be interacting with law enforcement. They may get stopped for panhandling or shoplifting or vagrancy or trespassing. And even if the person is not arrested, even if they're just contacted and they have a conversation with law enforcement, a lot of times a police officer will make a note of that person's name and location. And it may be a location, from 5 years ago. In one of the cases, we found 3 or 4 contacts of a person in a geographic area in a certain town. And once we had that location, we actually sent, it was an important case, sent canvassers to that area to go to shelters and talk to homeless people to say, hey, do you know this person? And it may be known by a different name. I'll make up a name instead of Robert. It might be, Bobby with, this is his details. And the one thing about the homeless population is they know the backstory of the other people, right? Do you know Bobby, who used to live in Phoenix and he used to be a carpenter, right? So when we asked around and canvassed the location, that is a good, let's take a look here, make sure we're still broadcasting the right way. Okay, looks like we are. Okay, good. Yeah, it may require a little more effort, a little more labor, but if it's important, those kind of things can happen unless the person is, living completely in the woods and nobody talks to them. It's usually pretty common they can be located because they've had interactions with services or with other people, even other people in that community. That may be a way to discover them. Even social security records. A lot of times people who are destitute, they avail themselves of social security or Medicare or Medicaid, and that all gets logged. So there's ways to find a person. If that's the kind of thing you're talking about. And again, from the message, it doesn't seem like it was the person could be homeless, but how do you find out where they are? If they've moved far away, if they, changed their name, maybe they're in a different community. Those are the kind of things that come up. Or, it could be something you want to verify for employment, or you want to verify for a contract. If you're looking to do business with somebody and you want to make sure that they are who they say they are, you may want to look back in their history to make sure that all of the details they've given about their location is correct. So good. There's a couple other questions we'll save for next time. One has to do with what's the most interesting type of case. We'll do that as the first one for our next video. And definitely, even if after the video is over, you have other questions, email them to help@activeintel.com. We'll put them on the list to talk about the next time we have a Ask an Investigator video. In the meantime, have a good weekend, and we'll catch up with you next week.